I'm just one person.
Determined
to bring us back to zero.
I'm just one person.
Determined
to bring us back to zero.
I am just one person.
Determined to bring us back to zero.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. So we're coming on the 16th, or we just passed the 16th anniversary of the Virginia Tech massacre. And Daniel, I know you were a campus safety advocate well before the Virginia Tech shooting. How would you describe the state of campus safety before April 16th, 2007?
I mean, it had been steadily improving since the Campus Security Act, now the Jean Cleary Act, had been passed in 1990. You already had more professional campus police departments and security departments, and you were starting to see greater integration and collaboration among offices on campus working on safety issues. The April 16th, 2007 shooting or mass casualty incident at Virginia Tech, however, was probably the single most transformative event in campus safety history in this country. It galvanized a nation, and I know we were getting inquiries from all over the world about what it meant when we were at security on campus. And as a result, we now have almost immediate notification of mass shooter or other emergency incidents on campus that's now enshrined in federal law, thanks in large part to Joe and the other families with VTV. We have behavioral intervention or threat assessment teams that work to catch threats before they happen. And although realistically, they're doing a better job making sure people get the care they need. And, catching incidents before they happen is really a smaller but still critical part of what they do. It was profoundly transformative for the better. And I think I would like to add that, and this is something to credit to Joe, that it's the living legacy of the 32 victims and, quite frankly, the shooter who wasn't served as well.
So, Joe, so 2007, 16 years ago, I mean, what resources were available for you, the families, the survivors, victims? I mean, what did that landscape look like back then?
Yeah, well, in the moment of the tragedy, there were really no resources. I mean, there were a lot of missteps and helping victims. And I saw it as where the policy was that victims advocates would be there to help us and guide us through this horrible process that you need to go through, including identification of your own loved one. And that was not required at the time. And those present that were trying to help us were traumatized as well. So I find it as a scenario where the traumatized were helping the traumatized, and that's not a good mix. We actually had to do thinking on our own and provide suggestions of how things should proceed. Among them, with Governor Kane at the time and Public Safety Secretary Marshall, we asked them, and told them what we want and what we need. But nobody was present to actually guide us through this, since it never happened to us before. Death notification, as you will see, is just a hodgepodge. And if it's not done right, those words that you hear from that person that tells you about the deceased or your loved one being killed, are words you will remember the rest of your life. So it is now mandated in Virginia that victims advocates do show up and help on the scene. So that's what I've experienced. I'm sure many of the other families and survivors experienced. And there's a lot more detail we could get into if the questions come up. Sure.
And thanks for bringing that up, Joe. So if for the participants, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A. There's chat, but there's also a Q&A button that you can type your question for the panelists, and we'll get to those in a little bit. Now, Janine, I mean, you obviously had experienced the tragedy on April 16, 2007. How did that event impact your life and in the path that you have moved forward since that point in time?
Sure. It's twofold. One is personal and one is professional. And I think for the audience to share some background, Rima Samaha, Joe's daughter, was a very good friend of mine, and we were both involved together in a dance group on campus. And the day before the Virginia Tech shootings was the very last day that we ever did a performance with Rima. And it was a beautiful day. It was such a celebration. So I do want to pause and take a moment to honor Rima's life, to honor her family, who, Joe and everybody. But the next day was so tragic. It unfolded almost quickly and slowly at the same time. The minutes that you're waiting to hear the information, to understand the communications at the time, we were so outdated compared to technology today. So that's kind of one of the first pieces. If you look at a before and after effect, we just didn't have the bandwidth even for from a cellular perspective, to even be able to communicate with people outside of Blacksburg. I remember spending hours and hours and hours trying to just get in touch with my own parents, trying to, we heard Rima was missing. We didn't know what was going on. We couldn't access anybody. So the piece there, the technology gap, was very significant. We had to rely on watching a television to get our information. So we're sitting there in our living room just waiting to see if there's any news. So it just shows you how outdated we're talking about technology back in 2007 versus today, where there are so many more improvements. But like Joe said, there were not a lot of resources for us at the time to know how to mentally absorb what was happening. We got 2 weeks off of school. We got time to kind of pause, because it's just too shocking to go back, jump right into school right after a situation like that. But then I realized we were all really left to our own kind of utilities to figure out how to comprehend what just had happened. So even aftercare, which Joe can talk about later, was not there. There was no aftercare for the whole community. So I found myself as a young architecture student trying to figure out over time, how can I give back? How can I do something to make the situation better? I went on to graduate school at MIT, where I studied schools and conflict zones, and I wanted to unpack schools in very high stress, high violent situations. How are students, how are school communities walking to school every day, choosing to still go to school? And through that experience, I learned about human resiliency and the importance of education. So that's kind of underpinned my career. And then subsequently, since my research in graduate school, I went on to do 10 years plus of school design work and really getting engaged in what the architects can do to support school safety design holistically, working with people, integrating technology, but also thinking about school systems, thinking about policies and procedures that help to make schools a safer place.
Thanks, Janine. Joe, Stafford asked, so in an ideal situation, what should have happened to help loved ones and the families? What would have been the ideal situation looking back retrospectively?
To help after in the aftermath of the shooting?
Yes.
Well, truth and honesty would have been good. They was arriving on campus and asking us why we were there. And we were told to go to a certain place on campus. And walking in the door, they asked why we were there, and asking us, "Do we know where our daughter is?" And I said, "Do you know where our daughter is?" And they said, "No, we don't. But here's a slip of paper," which they gave to me, and I still have that piece of paper today. And it had 3 numbers on it: 2 hospitals and the morgue. And they said, "Here's the phone." So we were left on our own to do these things, to pursue, and all the time knowing they knew our daughter was killed. They had her body identified. So I mean, that was the first step. Then you go through the autopsy process. You have 32 bodies, and you have 2 slabs in the morgue. And how do you process that? Very hard. And they want positive identification. And you advise them, well, you have the keys to all the dorm rooms. Please go do that yourself and get all the fingerprints you need. We're really left on our own to do that. And I had given the autopsy report over the phone and identifying features of our daughter. And the next day I was asked to do the same thing. And I was asking why I was doing the same thing. And they said, because we lost the report from last night. So just chaos. And the families were very focused on their own grief and their own tragedy. And there were hundreds of press outlets and media present. And to be honest, the only reason I wanted to speak to the press was to tell them we needed help. We were in a horrible situation, and we were going around in circles in that hotel, I would say, ballroom. And when the governor and Secretary of Public Safety showed up, I said, listen, this is how I think it should work. You need one liaison person for each family. So that's 32 people that you need volunteering to help us through this process, and people that know what they're doing. So that happened. And that helped things go a lot smoother. But it did take 4 to 5 days for the morgue to process and identify the 32 victims before they would release their bodies to the loved ones.
Who was taking the lead during that whole process? Was it the state? Was it the federal agency? Was it the university? I mean, the university cordoned off
the entire process, wanted to handle it internally, and they were not capable of doing that. They didn't have the expertise. I mean, we had people from the counseling center crying on our shoulder rather than us crying on their shoulder. So you really do need to bring in professionals, crisis response teams, people that have been trained and know what they're doing. To be honest with you, you could be trained and not know what you're doing, but not everybody can do it. It's a very hard position to fill, to work with people's grief.
And Dan, you know this better than anyone else. I mean, the culture on campuses, was very different on, a day before, especially with releasing information, because even though we had the Clery Act in place, culturally, how did universities and college handle crime information and sharing that publicly? And did they share it publicly, or what level did they share it publicly, and what happened after?
Well, the Clery Act has certainly been a major impetus in getting colleges and universities to be more transparent about campus crime and other safety information. And there's still the difficult issue of balancing accuracy versus promptness. And I think there was two factors in play, particularly on April 16th, 2007. There was a desire to have accuracy, which was legitimate. Then there was the controlling the messaging. People have to remember that it was not the public safety side of the equation making this decision. It was the administrators in a secure conference room making this decision. And that really tells you everything that you need to know. And I think for the most part, ever since, the culture is now one of transparency and openness and disclosure about this type of incident. And that's why you see a lot of times notices go out about a possible shooter or someone with a gun. They're erring on the side of caution and getting that word out. I think that has been a profound culture change. Yes, the law changed, but it's also one in the culture recognizing that the interest of controlling messaging and getting the information right are outweighed by getting out life-saving information. And by and large, we've seen a lot of buy-in. That's the culture now.
Well, we talk about technology and how technology changed, and why don't you just talk about that briefly, how the technology changed or how that impacted communication, especially Clery information, getting timely information to keep students out of harm's way.
Sure. Back in 1990, when the original Clery Act, Campus Security Act was passed, timely warnings were going out, being posted as flyers in campus buildings. Then as technology evolved, that evolved into sending them out via email. And in 2007, that was by far sort of the best, quickest way to get information out. Of course, text messaging had just come on the scene, or as you well know. And then in the years since, we've started to see a lot more channels, our multimodal broadcasting capabilities, so that you've got emergency alert boxes on campus, you've got public address systems, emergency blue phones have been turned into public address systems. You've got systems that pop up information on computer screens on campus so that someone cannot exit out of that until they acknowledge that they've seen it. And of course, social media is one other channel that is widely used. And of course, students get out ahead of it themselves. I talked to a lot of student journalists, and the first I've heard of a lot of the more recent shootings on campuses have been from student journalists who began posting on social media almost immediately. They're out ahead. And that's another reason that institutions have to be very quick about this and controlling the message, not in the way that I was talking about 16 years ago, but making sure disinformation isn't spreading on social media. So that's an additional challenge that we've got.
Oh, that certainly is. Disinformation. Everybody has a phone. Janine, we were talking yesterday about, the state of phones. I thought I had my phone with me. Yeah, I think I do, my prop. The phone, this was a state-of-the-art phone back in 2007. And, getting information out there by students was very difficult. You mentioned it was a challenge for you to figure out what's going on and get information and everything like that. But you're right, Daniel. Today, with Twitter and text messaging and Instagram and TikTok, there's information gets out there right away. Jeannie, what you were chatting about this yesterday, but your experience with the technology, what was that like? Yeah. What was your experience like?
It's funny if we think about it from a timeline perspective. So I was a student, right, for a bulk of my life. Graduated in 2010 from Virginia Tech in undergrad, and I went on to graduate school. I happened to be in Boston during the Boston bombings, during the marathon, if you remember that. There was also a shootout on campus. One of our school police officers was killed. So I happened to be in another scenario as a student, and I've lived through two kind of situations where we were put on complete pause. Now, the difference between what I experienced in MIT and then Virginia Tech, so we're talking about a few years later, the communication came out much faster. It was an alert notification to my cell phone. So we had slightly more advanced cell phones, but we knew we also had direction, stay in place, lockdown, don't move around. And also students now were all carrying, in terms of culture change too, we were just talking about moments ago, we all had a badge. And we all had now we were in our training when we were coming through orientation in school, we were told, if you don't recognize somebody, if someone's not wearing their ID, call them out and ask like, hi, how may I help you? Who are you? So there started to be almost policing, self-policing that has emerged on campus. So when you just talk about like the cultural shift, there is now a part of the worldview, the milieu on a student campus to really keep an eye out, keep your eyes on the street and pay attention for what might be happening. So in terms of the technology change, that's just one minor example. And then now for me as an architect personally, I think about how technology is a piece of the puzzle. We're just so much smarter about how we talk about school safety. Everything has to be highly integrated. And oftentimes when I talk about a building and securing at the building level, I say that a building is only as secure as the people who are operating it. So you could put in all the bells and whistles, you have access control, you could have security cameras everywhere. But if somebody wants to prop the back door open because they want to go smoke a cigarette and they want to put like a little brick in between, they'll do that. And then somebody with nefarious intentions can come in through that back door. So this is very holistic, what we're talking about. So as the advances are happening with technology, the advances also need to happen on the side of protocols and procedures, and you need to have a plan in place for every single type of emergency that could occur.
Joe.
Yeah, I'd like to add to this conversation on a higher level of communication. And we're talking about educating and creating the culture. So in 2007, at August, the very first day of school, and Janine will probably remember this, there was a shooter in Blacksburg, and he wasn't on campus, but he was around the campus. campus. And nobody really knew where he was, but for precautionary purposes, they did a lockdown. And I know that because our daughter, Rima, called me and said, Dad, there might be a shooter on campus or around campus. They've asked us to go back to our dorm rooms and close the door and pull down the shades. And we're having a lockdown. Well, fast forward to close to the end of the school year in April 16, 2007, there's a shooter on campus. We know that because there were 2 dead students in a dormitory, but there was no lockdown. So everybody thought it would be fine. And some of the stories that arose out of this is there's 2 students that actually came down from their dorm room to the front door. There was a state trooper there, and they asked the state trooper, was it safe to go to their classroom? And he said, sure. And those 2 students were killed in their classroom 2 hours later. So you have to be consistent in that communication, right? A lockdown didn't change. There were still 2 shooters. Why did you lock down one time and not lock down the other time? So that's part of this communication process, right? It's what becomes entrenched in the brains that everything's okay if there's no lockdown. Go ahead, Daniel.
I just wanted to follow up on something Janine said about Officer Sean Collier, who was killed in Boston. One of the things that we learned from that is that campus police officers are not eligible for federal death benefits. And there has been legislation over the years to try and change that. That has not yet succeeded. And I just wanted to note for everybody who's participating that IACLEA, the International Association of Campus Law Enforcement Administrators, I see their logo on your bookshelf, has been working to pursue that and would encourage everybody to get in touch with them and see what they can do to support that legislation. Is something we're pleased to support and hope everyone else can as well.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Yeah, what's interesting, Joe, the consistency with messaging. I mean, and we still have this today, the never here mentality that nothing will happen here. This is, no matter where you are, it is completely safe. But what is interesting, so after that, I mean, it seemed like, campuses did not want to be overzealous with sharing information about what's happening, because once again, it's the perception that this is a safe campus. Nothing happens here. But following that, campuses would, send, mass alerts, lock down campus, close school for the day until you know exactly what's happening. That did not happen until after April 16, 2007. That was a substantial cultural change, that it's okay to tell the entire community that something bad has just happened on campus. And we want to prioritize keeping people out of harm's way over having a PR issue that we have to deal with. That was a substantial difference. Janine, your thoughts?
Yeah, one of the interesting things hearing both you and Joe speak. So at the time at Virginia Tech, right, the folks who were managing this process predominantly were likely from the PR marketing department, where they're thinking about messaging from a PR perspective. Even in my conversations with a lot of the K-12 and higher ed schools that we've been talking to for years now, many of them don't have the right personnel hired with the expertise to even know where to begin when it comes to implementing security, how to think about messaging, how to think about these things. In my conversations, at least from a building perspective, oftentimes they were taking folks from the procurement office whose job it is to select computers or to select, paper and cartridge for ink. That's the type of folks who all of a sudden they were assigned with the position of becoming the school security expert and then also procuring school security infrastructure. So you've got the wrong people at play. And now we have a much better approach where a lot of school districts as well as campuses have school resource officers. They've got, close ties with local police departments, and they have the right personnel hired to make the appropriate administrative decisions, but also the right stakeholders need to be at the table. So you don't want just one voice present, because it isn't just a security issue, it's a safety issue. And Daniel can talk a lot about safety most likely, but there's a mental health component to this. There's the aftercare, all the pieces we've been talking about. So having everybody together at the table as you're designing your emergency protocol plan, that is critical, and that's part of the strategic work that institutions need to be focused on, and it needs to be proactive way long before any emergency is happening.
Amen. Daniel.
I just want to say I agree, and also wanted to put someone in the chat did clarify that that was for private institutions of higher education with sworn police officers. So sorry if I didn't make that clear.
No, thanks, Daniel. So what's interesting, Janine, so talking about getting the right people at the table, one of the things that has evolved, right, with so campus safety, I'm not saying that the things really changed, obviously, on April 16, 2007, and campus safety was looked at from a very different lens, especially technology, protocols, working together. So there's two things that you said, Janine, that I just want to follow up on the two holdings. The first thing you mentioned, about technology is great, and everything, but you have the human element, and this is just a cultural thing. I think most cultures around the world are like this, holding the door open for somebody behind you, you have the most secure building, but just it's very uncomfortable to say, can I see your badge, please? Or, I'm sorry, I have to shut the door and you're gonna have to walk in yourself. It's considered rude. And, I see that at my daughter's condominium and don't let people come in behind you, but it's just, I can't, Dad. It's rude. It's rude for me to do that, but that's a human element. So yes, all the security technology in the world, everything can be wonderful, but if you have that element, that's gonna be a factor. The other holding thing I wanted to mention, to your point about getting people to the table and getting information on, Daniel mentioned this, accuracy versus promptness. One of the best practices that has emerged since April 6, 2007 is pre-scripting your emergency messaging, right? So you get you have the PR people at the table, you have the emergency management folks at the table, you have administration at the table, you have the mental health professionals at the table. Let's craft our messages so they provide actionable information. You put out a holding message. So the holding, that was what I was going to mention, the holding message. Once a situation happens, getting the word out immediately, that's well thought out, well crafted, that you don't create on the fly. That's absolutely critical. But in order to do that, you need to have the right people at the table to discuss what are our protocols, how do we move things, what do we do, what do we say? You say different things to different people. So that was such an important factor. So I'm glad you did bring that up. Mr. Carr.
One of the important things about emergency notification is that, as I mentioned, it is since 2008 been a federal requirement. And the Clery Act provides a structure for creating the process, where you have to have a policy, you have to disclose that policy to the campus community. And what we recommend that institutions do, what we work with our clients to help them do, is to bring together all those stakeholders to craft those policies and the procedures so that everyone is comfortable. And often, as you said, having those pre-scripted messages makes, I think, a lot of the folks a lot more comfortable, because what we see with our clients often is they're authorizing the patrol officer, the dispatcher, to push the button on the emergency notification now. It's not going through the chief, it's not going to the president, it's going to that officer on patrol, the dispatcher, maybe, in some cases, it's going to the shift supervisor. But that pre-scripting has allowed that level of comfort in getting those messages out so that they're prompt and they provide actionable information.
No doubt. And so what's interesting is that, so with ZeroNow, we're actually seeing a lot more interest and activity from K through 12, because K through 12 is experiencing now what higher education experienced 16 years ago, and which is very disappointing. It's very unfortunate. The fact that we're still dealing with this today, this is still an active issue. We haven't gotten beyond it and addressed the mass casualties and school shootings for good is just obviously very disappointing. And that's the whole point of these conversations are, okay, what can we learn and how can we apply those, and how can we get to zero harm and move that way? So a lot of the experiences that you have been through and have over the last almost 2 decades are things that K through 12 can understand, because a few years ago was not at the same situation. Joe, so we're talking about the things that the experience that you had from the aftermath. So tell us about what the families did and how you addressed the issues that you faced and the gaps that you faced and how you organized the families from Virginia Tech and the subsequent work that you did and what you're doing today. We'd love to hear more about that.
Well, I think what we lived was, on our journey was very amazing, and that we came together as a group, at least those that could, and we wanted to know why and how can we fix it. And before we knew it, there were, almost 32 families and 17 injured students who said, yeah, we want to do this. And as part of our settlement, during those discussions, we said, we want to make the school where this happened the gold standard of campus safety and security for the nation. And of course, there was an ongoing research and investigation put together by Governor Kane at the time, now Senator Kane, as to find out what did happen and what did go wrong and how can we make it better next time around, which would be, and that report was released in August of the same year, 2007, because he wanted that information before school started again. And so prior to that report coming out, we already knew what some of the gaps were. And the family said, campus safety and security, number one mission. Number two mission, help those that are impacted by the same mass shootings that we have been impacted by across the country. So it took some time, of course. You never get consensus, but you can get majority. And most of the families did move forward with these missions, this twofold mission. First, addressing campus safety and security. And that we had to do through legislation. And creating threat assessment teams by law in Virginia was the first step. And, you go through the machinations of that when you have, various heads of departments or participants from various departments needing to share information. And they go, well, there's a privacy law. Well, we go, well, how can you have a threat assessment team and not share information? Counseling center and law enforcement and school administrators and so forth, and figure out what's going wrong with that student. That threat assessment team is a safety net. So we had the law passed, and what's really unique about the process is that we got that passed in Virginia for all state institutions, but private institutions were not mandated to create threat assessment teams. I think it has become best practice, and I thought it should be best practice and people would follow. I found that there are 9 states that have mandated threat assessment teams in this country for colleges. Only 9.
And Joe, so prior to this point, did threat assessment teams exist, and was there such thing as a threat assessment team prior to this?
Well, Daniel can address this. I'm going to say no. At least they weren't mandated.
They weren't mandated. Gene Dysinger, who I know would have loved to have been here today, but had another commitment, would be much more knowledgeable about this, but he really had pioneered that in the early 2000s. But it was at such a small number of institutions, it wasn't, a standard, it wasn't a best practice. And of course, Virginia Tech hired him after the shooting to create one there. And, that has really become a model now across the country and across the world. But, so it did exist, but that was one of the other major changes that came as a result. It does. Yes, Joe.
No, go ahead. Continue.
I was just going to say, it varies significantly from institution to institution in size and public or private. We see a lot of variety. So there's not necessarily a true consistency across the country about what they look like. I think I do want to remind people, though, is that one of their most important functions isn't just identifying the next shooter. It's making sure that students and others on campus get the help they need. And that is by far what they do, far more day to day than identifying the next active shooter. And if they're successful, those people get the help they need early in the process, and they never get to the point where that's something they're willing to consider.
A great point, Daniel.
I would skip forward. I think that threat assessment probably is necessary in K through 12 now,
Oh, absolutely.
unfortunately.
Yeah, I will add, so in the building industry, there are different types of assessments that we do for especially existing facilities. We're not looking at identifying threats in terms of individuals, but we're looking at weaknesses in the infrastructure that could create a more susceptible situation for whether it's an active shooter or other types of violence that can occur on a building, or even other types of natural disasters, other occurrences. And so for architects, we're thinking really about when we do a landscape assessment of all the various threats, we look at everything from the natural world all the way through potential harm that can be caused with somebody with bad intentions, even petty crime, right? So, we can talk a little bit maybe later about this, but we implement something called crime prevention through environmental design. It's one of the canons of safety design. And it's not just limited to schools or campuses. It's actually pervasive in all sorts of building types, including housing and so forth. So there are mechanisms and lenses and different ways to think about a framework for how you look holistically at all of the various threats that any institution or community could be susceptible to.
So Janine, did that, was it SEPTED? Did that exist prior to April 16, 2007, or is that something relatively new?
No, I mean, the roots of SEPTED, crime prevention through environmental design, they go back to the 60s. And then in the 70s, they actually became authored in a book at that time. And then there is a whole international community that works on SEPTED. So it's been around, but the roots of SEPTED were not necessarily designed for schools. We didn't look at schools as a hotbed of potential crime and violence. It was actually designed for housing. So when you look at community housing back in the 60s and 70s, there was the country was in a different climate at that time. So when you look at crime in the 70s, it was very different. So when we talk, though, about today, how SEPTED is being applied, it has become integrated in a lot of municipalities and jurisdictions in the permitting process. So if you're getting a building through, whether it's a new construction or a major renovation, SEPTED might actually be called upon in the permit review process. So the same way you have a stamp by an engineer, stamp by the architect, they want to see documented proof that you've had a certified SEPTED when you think about the design process, it's so valuable to get and take advantage of the design process for thinking about safety integration.
No doubt. No, thanks, Janine. So Joe, going back to
Sure.
the report from the findings from the
Right.
Commonwealth of Virginia, what were some of the key findings from that report?
Well, as I go through this legislation, you'll know what those findings were. So, and I'll only mention 4 here, maybe just 3. But knowing that a student is having difficulties and says something potentially suicidal and referred to the counseling center, that the counseling center in Virginia now, this is also mandated by law, that they can actually pick up the phone and call home to the parents and let them know what's going on. We're working about HIPAA and FERPA and all of that. We just said we have to cut through this, to save people, and the General Assembly agreed. Again, if you're 26 or younger and you're on your parents' tax returns, they definitely can do that. So 18 is not a requirement for privacy anymore if it comes to something that's life or death. One of the biggest gaps was when this perpetrator was adjudicated mentally ill, a danger to himself and others, he was ordered to actually call and make an appointment with the counseling center. And he did. That happened to be the last day of classes before winter break. And he never went to the counseling session. And when they came back from winter break, he went straight to campus and never followed up on an appointment, nor did anyone in the counseling center follow up on the appointment. And then we see him again on April 16, 2007. So this lack of follow-up, right? And I think parents, when they do research schools, and I know most parents do with their children, decide where they're going to go, I think they need to look into not just the academics, the athletics, but they also need to look into the public safety component of what the university is doing. We also had legislation passed where in Virginia they must do, we fondly called it the drill bill. So where the heads of the universities must read their policies and understand their policies on campus safety protocol. They also must certify to the Department of Education that they have read it and they do understand it. And then they can put the document on the shelf if they want to. So, and there was a gap in what the community colleges do. They don't have the support and the counseling that some students may need. So now they must be referred out from the community center of community colleges to either the four-university counseling center or another counselor. And I may have that loosey-goosey on some of this explanation, but that's the general thought. I will say this because I know we're running short on time. All of this costs money.
Right.
And it's expensive, but it's also the lives of your students, your professors, your faculty, your children, your grandchildren. It's their lives at stake. Sure, it costs money. And everything that you can do proactively is better than doing it retroactively. And that's been the case in most of these situations. People have not learned their history and they figure it's never going to happen to them. But let me tell you, when it does, you're going to say, why didn't we? Right? I know there are educators on this seminar, and there's a way to be proactive, and we created that document as well, and that's called 32 National Campus Safety Initiative, and that is a self-assessment, a confidential self-assessment that universities can take. I think high schools can take them as well. It is administered by our partner NASPA, and it's just very objective. And I'll just use the threat assessment as one of the questions. It's, do you have a threat assessment team? Yes or no? And if you answer yes, check it. If you answered no, the next question is, what do you have? So if it's not, it's provocative. It's a self-assessment. You're not going to tell the world if you're missing something. That's just a red flag to tell you, go get it. Sure, it's going to cost money, but that's okay. I'm telling you, in the end result, Virginia Tech spent $48.2 million of taxpayer money and their own money to repair and fix and whatever it was involved in that, even changing door handles to push bars on campus was $1 million fix. If they got ahead of that, the perpetrator never would have chained the door shut. So as stakeholders, we need to work together. We need to sit down at the table together and discuss all of this and see if it can be done nationwide and not wait till it's too late.
Exactly. You're absolutely right, Joe. Janine.
Yeah, the investment piece is so critical. And I think that when we speak to so many schools, especially in the architecture kind of design process, it's required. I mean, it's part of the process. It's best practice. But I found that in my conversations with schools, they're still having a hard time navigating best information and best practices. And again, they still don't have the right personnel always. So one of the pieces of legislation that the AIA worked really hard to back was to try and get a federal approved clearinghouse with best practices and resources for every single, again, piece of this pie, whether it's from technology and mental health to architecture. And that passed the House, passed the Senate, and it's now up online. So that's schoolsafety.gov, and it's a very robust clearinghouse with a lot of information. So if school districts are just like, I don't even know where to begin, or universities, I dropped it in the chat because that's just such a simple place to start and to get educated. And what if you don't get educated, what happens is oftentimes you are bombarded by information on Google, and you are going to the first thing that pops up. And unfortunately, I've seen school districts install things and then the next summer uninstall them, because in fact, what they've installed is something that is illegal. It's not per code, and it creates other dangers and other situations. So, you got to think holistically. Are you putting in, I've seen devices that lock doors from the inside and then they're not operable. And then in the case of a fire and you have to have that egress path, it's locked, can't get out. So there are things that you have to think holistically through. And I look at procurement folks getting kind of googly eyed over something that looks like a quick fix, and it's not. So you really got to think through that and not make Band-Aid choices when it comes to the infrastructure selections.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And I'm glad you mentioned the schoolsafety.gov. That is an excellent resource, and it has so much in there. And making it easy for schools to take that first step is critical. A couple of things that both you and Joe touched upon that I wanted to point out. And we're getting close to running out of time here. We're going to have to do a second part of this discussion, because I really want to go into more depth about 32 NCSI. So I'm going to have to do that as a separate session. But a couple of things. So next month, we're actually, this conversation is going to focus on the politics of school safety. And you might wonder, that's interesting. Well, being proactive with school safety is often a political landmine. We often hear from school board superintendents, well, if we're going to proactively invest in school safety, does that mean we have a problem here? What does that project that we have an issue if we're going to implement better safety measures and training and technology and protocols and all that? And no, that doesn't mean, like you said, Joe. I mean, you either, I know you mentioned this before, you either invest that you pay now or you pay later, and you don't want to go through that as a reactive measure. You want to be proactive with that, proactive with your safety measures. And there are, to your point, Janine, yes. Just don't go with the first sales call that you get, like, oh, this is great stuff. You install this and your school will be safe for good. You got to look at things holistically, and hopefully part of the ZeroNow community is about having those discussions, connecting with other like-minded safety professionals or people that are advocates for safety. Like, well, what can we do to be proactive? What works? What are some things that we tried that might work for you and that didn't work? So those are all very important things. I do want to take a couple questions that came in from our participants when they registered. So Dr. Geller, hey, Dr. Scott Geller, how you doing? We saw you on here. So Dr. Geller asked, how has the Virginia Tech tragedy influenced your behavior? Janine, you want to take that one? Because you kind of touched upon it about earlier, how obviously you experienced it very differently than any of us here.
Yeah, I think at a personal level, it's really taught me that the fear and just being afraid that something could happen can sometimes be very consuming. And I've learned to work with communities to think through the potential of a threat, but also think through the potential of overly designing your infrastructure to such a degree that you're now creating bunkers and you're creating almost like torture chambers for learning. And so for me, when it comes to how do you really approach such a sensitive topic, I think it's taking a measured stance. It's talking through it with folks like Joe and Daniel and listening to everybody authentically at the table and taking your time to unpack what is such a complicated issue. It is political, it is emotional, but also we can be smart about it. I remember listening after Parkland to, I don't know if you all watched this, but there was a huge broadcast on TV with a town hall, and a student from Parkland stood up and asked one of the public officials in Florida, why don't we design more of our schools like bunkers, like our airports, almost to the point where there's no windows, there's nothing. I just want to feel safe and I don't want to be afraid of anything. And so that fear can be all consuming, especially in the immediate post of a situation. So I've just had to learn almost in a cathartic way to use architecture and design to work through what happened in my personal experience, but then also to really take a measured approach when it comes to integrating school safety design.
Janine, what do you think of this statement? This has come up on some of our members. You know, we need to build a fortress, like an invisible fortress, not prisons.
I'm absolutely number one. I think an invisible fortress is also still potentially a fortress, but if there are ways to integrate invisibly, yes, some of the pieces we're talking about, because again, you don't want fear to dominate the minds of students. There's a way to feel safe without also being reminded daily that you are potentially under threat. So it's that balancing act, and we absolutely don't want to design our schools to be as prisons. The next phase of the work that I'm doing is very interested in looking at equity and thinking about identity and race and how school safety should be designed for everyone. Gun violence is pervasive throughout this country, not just because of a mass shooter incident, but there are cities that I've been working in where there is pervasive daily gun violence. Students hear gunshots all day when they're in school. So we need to be thinking holistically about all of the potential threats that students are dealing with, and but not losing, they should not lose their opportunity to learn. I mean, I loved my opportunities and time in school. I get really sad at the thought that kids now have to study in a prison. Just breaks my heart.
Yeah, and we need to change that. We'll take one last question, and this is, I'll direct this towards Daniel. So Brent Newbanks from the Meade Police Department asks, so what is the one change in policy that has had the most impact on preventing shootings, and how do we know that? So is there any one change in policy that has had the most impact?
I don't know that there's any one single change in policy that I would say that has done that. And I think I'd say the two things in tandem are what we've been talking about. The threat assessment teams, which as Joe pointed out, in most jurisdictions are not mandated. There's not an actual like federal policy, but it is an institutional level policy, at least in higher education, that is essentially an industry standard, at least for most traditional residential four-year colleges and universities. When you get smaller than that, it becomes less consistent. And then, of course, the emergency notification, which, yes, is a federal law, but it's also been a change in culture. That institutions focus on the transparency, getting the word out. And you can't just pass a law and have it change the world. You've got to have the culture change that goes along with it. And this was one of those instances where I think the culture change from the Virginia Tech shooting actually sort of predated the law. And it was already driving that, was already an impetus for that. So I'd say those two things.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. And so before we wrap things up, I just want to hear some final thoughts and words of wisdom, because we have more questions than we have time to answer them. Immediately following this, if you go to the ZeroNow community online website, community.zeronow.org, we'll populate the questions that came in that we were unable to answer live, and our panelists will respond to those. And you can, if you have additional questions, you can throw those into the Q&A in the community as well. And then when the replay is available, we can review that. But so just go. Joe, we'll start with you. Just any final thoughts? Final thoughts for our participants?
Yeah.
You want to share?
Final thoughts are this holistic approach that we talk about. So Janine is here to represent an aspect of it. I'll call it the hardware. And ZeroNow has a lot of partners that work on the software and policy with Daniel. And what we probably forget about is the hardware, the HEART ware, or the culture change that is really needed to prevent violence in schools and in our society. And it's a long process, that culture change is, but you got to plant the seed somewhere. And starting K through 12 might be a great place to start and helping people and creating those safety nets for those students while they're in the yellow zone before they cross into the red zone.
Exactly.
And I think that's part of this holistic approach that really can work, but it's not easy and there's a financial cost to it. But again, Ara said it eloquently, you pay now or you pay later. So it's not all about the image and, you know, the of the institution. This is hard work, and we got to get started on it, and actively caring for people, being proactive in helping people and creating those safety nets in schools is a way to pay forward.
Be kind. Just don't hold the door open for people. Janine, your final thoughts for our participants.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you to all of you for organizing this. I think the last message for me is just, I am always in awe of human resilience and the spirit to kind of move forward and move on, despite now so many shootings happening on a daily basis and occurrence in this country. The education is important, and I don't want to lose sight of that mission, the mission to educate young minds. And if we can kind of collectively as a country come together and work through this hard, dark period in our country, we can hopefully win back our education.
And we will. We're not going to stop till we do. Daniel, final thoughts, sir.
I think just that I'm very grateful for this opportunity to have this conversation, and to Joe and the other families who have, through their loss, really led the way for everyone else. Eternally grateful for having had the opportunity to work with them, to still work with them. I think that's my closing thought.
Great, and thank you all for joining us in this conversation. Let's keep this conversation going afterwards in the community, and really appreciate your sharing your insights, experiences with everybody. Because, like Janine, and I mean, you said we cannot accept this as the new normal. Okay, it's when the unthinkable happens, becomes thinkable, becomes a reality. We just can't accept that. So we need to work towards getting to zero harm, zero fatalities. That's the only way we can do it.